Hi. Today we're going to talk a bit about the next chapter in the Keenan book. And as you can see, I'm sharing the PowerPoint slides. You may opt to not listen to this and just scroll through it. I'm just going to give a brief review of some of the things that I feel that are salient for you to know as we go forward. So we're talking about the developing brain. What the brain is such an incredible structure. And if you look at the different types of cells it really is serving billions of neurons and more connections than we can ever even imagine. So at birth, you really want to think about how the fact that there are very few pre-wired structures in the brain that deal with new information. And of course, that makes a lot of sense because when we come into this world, we, from the second of birth, if not even before so, we are learning. We're a learning being. And the neuron building and creation of new information is called neuroproliferation. And that's where the brain is actually genetically programmed to create more synapses and neurons early in life. In other words, we are pre-wired to just have this explosion of proliferation. When we have neural death, it does not necessarily mean in the creation of new knowledge, learning, etc., that is a bad thing. Some of the neurons are programmed to die to provide more space for more critical cells. So there is a process called pruning, synaptic pruning, that is created. And the connections that are used are myelinated. That's the process in which biologically they are covered, if you might say, with myelin, and they're coated. C-O-A-T-E-D, not C-O-D-E-D. The experience dictates with connections that between what's kept. So in other words, the more we experience something, the stronger the connections. And when we don't get sufficient reinforcement, those things undergo or don't undergo myelinization and then are sort of thrown away and discarded. Fascinating if you think about it. So if you really look at birth, this is a great graphic. At birth, you see that there are few neural connections, and look at the difference between birth and 6. But I think even more surprising is what we talk about between 6 and 14. If you go back to what's going on in terms of what we talk about sort of in pop culture, there is a huge push within education to really talk about this birth to 5 range of age, because the richness of experiences and the more input we're giving to that young, growing, synaptic creating brain, the so much better off that we are. Then as we get into going into the teen years, right, 14 or so, you see that that death sort of happening, and that there's selectivity going on with those neurons. So again, just keep in mind this term of that neuroproliferation, because it allows the brain to be able to compensate for early damage, to replace connections, or sometimes to transfer functions to other places in the brain. And that's a term that we talk about in terms of brain plasticity. And the older you go forward in your development, the more difficult it is to have a plastic brain, so to speak. And what I will do is I have a video that I will support with this idea. It's very fun. It's called the backward bicycle, and I'll post it this week. So let's look at the large level, the macro level brain structures. And again, this may be a repeat of things that you've had in human development in high school, but I think these are really important things to talk about so we have some sense of what typical development is really all about. The cerebellum is covered by the cerebral cortex, which has two hemispheres, two sides, and it's joined in the center by a structure called the corpus callosum. The brain itself is really divided into four lobes. The frontal lobe, which develops actually towards the end of our development, and really we talk about the brain not being fully developed until 25 because of that frontal lobe higher mental functioning is kicking in. The temporal lobe, which overall is responsible for language, hearing, and smell. The parietal lobe, which is the processing bodily sensations, and the occipital lobe, which is our visual processing. When we talk about the brain in terms of the left side versus the right side organization, it basically begins at birth, and the differences between the two hemispheres pretty much remain the same into adulthood. That's a term that's called the invariance hypothesis. Each hemisphere matures at a different rate. Evidence seems to suggest right now that the right hemisphere matures much earlier than the left. The left side controls movement and sensation on the right side of the body, and the right side controls motion or movement and sensation on the left side of the body. And again, when we continue to talk a little bit about that specialization, the right and the left side specializes in language processing, and the right side is specialized for processing spatial information, music, some aspects of language in terms of pragmatics. We'll talk a little bit more about language development as we go forward. And it's important to know that this is not an absolute, because there is research out there that suggests there could be differences with that particular theory. The specialization of the hemispheres is a term called lateralization. And again, like I said earlier, we talk about brain plasticity, and our cerebral cortex is really very fluid, very plastic. So the cortex has a high capacity for learning. While there is this plasticity, if a part of the cortex is damaged or other parts can take over the tasks that would be handled. And we see that in medical research in terms of traumatic brain injury in young children, or in very rare cases where there has to be a part of the brain that has to be taken away because of disease, that in some cases, the other side of the brain seems to take over some of those functions. And once the hemispheres have lateralized, it can't be as plastic. So once that lateralization happens, that specialization, the controls can't really be recovered to the same extent as they were in earlier parts of our development. So if you look at this chart and say the color of the word, the color, not the word. So boy, did I mess that up, huh? So if you look at it, you have to really concentrate if there is and see that there is a left and a right brain conflict, right? The right side of the brain tries to say the color, and the left side of the brain tries to read the color. So take a couple moments. And if need be, stop the video, and I'll go forward. Try this on your friends. So one of the really exciting forefronts in brain research is developmental neuroscience. It's how the brain relates to perceptions and thoughts and feelings and social engagement. So the thing that's so amazing is that we have this incredible medical technology, and using the fMRI, which is a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, we can take a look at the lifespan of brain growth and loss. So suffice to say, it's really important that we have brain stimulation in our early years. And for most babies, sufficient stimulation is there for them every single day. Depriving a child of a rich, caring environment really does impair their brain development. And it can be true that overstimulation can also lead to negative consequences. So really, in terms of a summary of this whole chapter, understanding the brain and the central nervous system really holds the key to the understanding of all sorts of things with the child's environment. If you think about children who have loss of vision or children who have loss of hearing, there is a portion of that stimulus that their brain will not get. And so how do we afford additional ways and spaces to create this enriched brain development for them? So have a great week. I'll talk to you again. And I know that if you have any questions, you will email me.